Oh, it's 10. I think we'll go ahead and jump in today. We are really glad to have all of you here today for what is our 12th week of Master Gardener Intern training. It is hard to believe that the time has been flying by. Today is a beautiful morning to talk about wildlife and flowers in our garden. That is exactly what we're going to do. We have two great speakers who are coming to us from two of our allied departments, entomology and plant pathology, as well as forestry, wildlife, and fisheries. So we're going to start our morning with apiculture, specifically honeybees. I have already apologized to Dr. Tsuruda for not being able to find any appropriate honeybee pictures. They're just all bumblebees on my photo collection, but I'm sure that she will show you some. She always has fabulous pictures. And then the second half of our presentation is going to be specifically about supporting birds in your residential area. And so we're really excited to jump in today. There is lots of great information for you on the website. So there are publications that talk really specifically about landscaping for wildlife and matching species for different larval hosts, pollinators, nectar support, all of those sorts of things. There are some great connections to a lot of accessory information that will help you really dig into this information. And the other thing that I want to share with all of you is we are gearing up for our state conference. In fact, if you heard Evangeline and I talking beforehand, we were talking about one of the sessions that is going to be a gourd crafting session at the state conference. And that's what we were talking about prepping for. It is going to be June the 9th, 10th, and 11th. It's hosted by our Northeast Tennessee Master Gardeners. Our Sullivan County crew is on here today. And it will be a Thursday, Friday, Saturday in the mountains of Northeast Tennessee. It's going to be rhododendron season. We have a lot of great sessions. And so at Master Gardener at tennessee.edu, our state webpage, you will find all of that information. I'll probably send it out in the information that goes out tomorrow. So it is absolutely open to all of our interns as well as our long-term Master Gardeners. So we would love to see you there for a great opportunity to connect, meet others, and enjoy great horticulture. So as always, we look forward to having your great questions. And Celeste and I will watch the question portal and pass those on to Jennifer. We have purposefully saved a little bit of extra time so that we make sure that we get all these pollinator questions because there's always lots of great discussion. So as we transition, I'll stop my share so that Dr. Tsuruda can go ahead and put on her screen share. We're really glad to have Dr. Jennifer Tsuruda with us. She is, as I mentioned, one of my faculty colleagues in the entomology and plant pathology department. We have the opportunity to work together on some pollinator plots and other projects. And we're just so glad that she is bringing her expertise specifically in apiculture and beekeeping with us today. It's an area that our programs actually link up. We have many Master Gardeners who are, in fact, beekeepers. And as we think about the broader ways that we can support stewardship in our environment, this is a great way for us to become increasingly conscious about pollinators, bees, and of course, other wildlife species. So Jennifer, we are just really glad that you're bringing your expertise and your beautiful presentations to us today. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me today. It's so great to be able to talk to you all and have these collaborative interactions. And we will work on creating some a chapter in your big binder that Natalie's put together. It's in the plans. We're so swamped with getting everything else done. It's in the works. So thank you so much. Really appreciate this opportunity. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about pollinators, but also about pollinator planting. So the value of pollinators and then why and how we can support them. So as mentioned, I am the honeybee specialist, but that translates into caring about a lot of different types of pollinators in the environment. And so we usually can think more visually about the value of pollinators when we look at the types of foods that we eat in our diets. And so this is a nice picture from Scientific American or Pictures, looking at what your breakfast looks like with pollinators on the left and without pollinators on the right. And so what you see here, hopefully you can see some of the obvious differences here are the fruits and the jam or jelly and the fruit juice, and also some of those tree nuts and some of those cranberries that are in that granola mix. but you're also missing dairy. And so I always joke around that it's not that the bees are actually pollinating cows, but they're actually pollinating the food that the cows consume. And so there are indirect benefits of the pollinators on our diets too. And there is some types of coffee. So most of the coffee we drink here in the US is Arabica, which does pretty much okay on its own. But if we ever start switching to more of Robusta coffees, that requires a little bit more cross-pollination. So even your coffee could go missing over time if we lose out on some pollinators. Other ways to think about this is that about a third of what we eat benefits somehow through animal pollination. It's not just bees, it's all types of animals, but primarily in the United States, the type of managed pollinator we use for most of our crops are bees. And we'll get into different types of pollinators in just a second. If you think about that, one out of every 3 bites of food you eat has somehow benefited through animal pollination. That's huge, assuming you eat a balanced and healthy diet. And then in addition to that, if we think about it in the bigger scheme of things, the value of the crops in the United States that result or benefit from insect pollination is over $29 billion. And of that, honeybees are doing the majority of that, mostly because in large cropping systems, it works really well to have a movable bee system where we can instantly increase the numbers of pollinators in a field, whereas some of the other types of bees may be more efficient pollinators, but they aren't existing in the numbers that we need in nature. And farming practices can have some influences and impacts there as well. So that is one reason why we use honeybees. Another reason why is, even though they are not native to the United States or North America, is that many of the crops that we grow here in the United States are not actually native to North America either. And so this was a nice paper that I found that's showing all these different food crops where they're from worldwide. And you can see that North America has some awesome food crops that originate here, but a lot of the diversity that we have in our diets comes from crops from other countries. And so because of that, it really helps to have generalist pollinators like honeybees that will pollinate many of these different types of crops. So if we think about that, these different types of pollinators, there's a beautiful poster from the Pollinator Partnership that shows many of the different types of animal pollinators out there. But one of the big types of pollinators that we rely a lot on, especially out in West Tennessee with our row crops, is wind. So a lot of our grains are wind pollinated, and that's what's basically moving the pollen grains from one plant to another or from one flower to another. And then we also have these, have these animal pollinators. And here you can see a lot of diversity, but this is worldwide. Many of these do not exist here in the United States or North America. But we also have many types of other animals that can do pollination for us. So there are birds, there are bats. Most of the bats in this area, I believe, are insectivorous. So they're consuming insects rather than necessarily doing a lot of pollination for us and relying on nectar. But we also have so many different types of insects. And so in this collage, you can see that there are flies, there are bees, there are wasps, there are beetles, and they're using these flower habitat areas for different reasons. So you can see these beetles are aggregating here. They do consume the flowers and the pollen, but they're also using this as an aggregation site for mating. So there are different reasons that the flower sites are being used and where pollen is getting moved around from flower to flower. It may not always be an intentional effort. And of these insects, 2 of the big ones, or 2 subcategories, are bees and honeybees. And that's partially because the diet of bees is really plant focused. So bees are collecting nectar as their carbohydrate sugar resource, and then they're collecting pollen as their protein resource, but it also contains minerals and vitamins and lipids and all these other good things for them to have a nutritious diet. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more, just because honeybees are my favorite, just wanted to talk a little bit about some of these other benefits that we can get from honeybees besides pollination. So of course we get honey because they are honeybees, and we get that in excess. We bred bees and we manage them in ways where we can get excess honey for human consumption. We try not to push them too far or take too much off and be greedy, because then those colonies tend not to survive very well. But we can use this honey in many different ways. Most of the time we're consuming it, but there are ways we can use honey as a medicinal, like a wound healing patch. There's actually an FDA approved patch on the market. There are also people who can consume, or people who choose to consume, the pollen as a way to decrease allergies, but under doctors' supervision, because if you're really allergic, you don't want to be consuming pollen because it can set off an allergic reaction. So there's usually a dose plan there of how much to eat. And then we can also collect wax from colonies, from honeybee colonies. So bees actually produce the wax themselves. They have glands on their abdomens, which I'll show you a picture of in just a second. And so that wax can be used in many different ways. So obviously with candles, we can also use small amounts of the wax in things like soaps and lotions and other types of cosmetics. And then the other one is mead, or one of the other things is mead, and that actually comes from fermenting honey. So it's a gluten-free, basically a sweet wine is from fermenting honey. Kind of a good thing to do if you already have honey that's starting to ferment anyway. So lots of different benefits that we can get from bees, and I'm just using honeybees as an example here. But I just want to kind of switch over a little bit. We talk about honeybees, but there are many types of bees that exist in the world and even in North America. And there's an interesting study that was actually looking at the level of interest the public has in supporting bees, but also their understanding. And so when given this collage of different types of insects and asked which ones are bees, a lot of people get honeybees and bumblebees correct. If we all had the chance, we could do a poll, but I'm worried about time, so I won't. But hopefully you'll recognize number 8 as a honeybee and number 2 as a bumblebee. But there are also many other types of native bees involved in this collage. So 4, 6, 7, and 10. And number 9 actually looks like an ant, but it's actually a wingless wasp. And number 1 is a fly, number 3 is a butterfly, and number 5 is a grasshopper. But when asked, the people who are really into bee conservation, many of them can't even identify what bees are. And so a natural way to kind of get into increasing this public understanding of pollinators, and especially bees, is not only to increase their appreciation of the value of these pollinators, but for them to start planting habitat as a way to observe them in their home situation or out on the farm, and to use this as an educational tool and appreciation of the nature that surrounds them. And I just want to go through some slides rather quickly. Some of these are obvious in terms of the value of pollinators. So, oftentimes we talk about the production of fruits and vegetables. So here I'm showing a lot of examples here that are grown in the Southeast region. And, some of these vegetables are not truly the vegetables. We're eating the fruit of the plant itself. So like squashes. And Natalie's fortunately growing some stuff out of the organic farm. And so it benefits my bees, and hopefully she'll find it a benefit to her too, that they go and they pollinate some of these plants as well. But some of the less obvious or less known benefits are through pollination of certain types of crops for seed production or oil production or fiber production. And so you may or may not recognize this plant here on the left. This is canola. And so in order for us to get canola oil, you have to have canola seeds. In order to get the seeds, you have to have pollination of these flowers. And so honeybees are actually a great pollinator of canola. It's grown a lot in different regions, not so much here. I've had kind of mixed results getting a good harvest of canola, or a good crop growing out here. But I have had some come up, and it's a kind of a nice different floral opportunity for the bees to work. And then over here on the right hand side is alfalfa. Here you can see this large bee with huge pollen loads collecting here from this alfalfa plant. And a lot of people like alfalfa honey when honeybees are working this crop. So there's an added benefit there. And also we can think about pollinators in terms of their value in natural areas and conservation. And these are areas where we typically are not going to see a lot of honeybees, and in areas where we do want to think about biological diversity and conservation, that's probably not the best place to have things like honeybees, where we can have some competition or high levels of competition. And so natural areas, I like to think about whatever the natural plants are and the natural pollinators for those. It's not like an agricultural system where we're trying to boost yields of non-native crops. And I will point out that I guess this will lead in a little bit for the next talk, is that these pollinator habitats can also benefit in terms of supporting other types of wildlife. So whether it be birds feeding on the seeds of these flowers, or sometimes they're feeding directly on the insects that are in this field. Not so much my bees, because they can usually fly away pretty quickly, but you can have things like caterpillars feeding on the plants that can help feed these birds too. And in reality, some people think that's, well, I planted this to help the pollinators, but if you are helping them, you usually end up with so many that are being produced that you can help support the other wildlife a little bit as well too. So lots of different opportunities there. And then lastly, since we're talking mostly about master gardening and thinking more about home gardens, there are lots of plants in home gardens that require pollinators too, or benefit from them. And it's really hard to see here, but in this tomato flower, there's a little tiny bee there working this flower. And one of the interesting things is that plants in the family Solanaceae, things like eggplants and tomatoes, they have these pendulous flowers that hang downwards, and they don't just have their pollen hanging out on the flowers. They require something called buzz pollination, and this is something that honeybees do not do. But you have some of these usually larger, but some of the smaller bees can do it too. They'll have these large bees come up and hold their bodies against the flowers in the same orientation as this bee here, where they're kind of upside down with their bellies up, and they vibrate their thoracic wing muscles against this flower at just the right frequency that the flower then releases its pollen onto the bee. And then the bee has it all over its fuzzy self and then goes to the next flower and does the same thing. It doesn't mean that honeybees can't, or some of these other bees that don't do buzz pollination can't benefit these crops. It's just that the main pollinators are going to be these buzz pollinators. And then once that pollen gets released, that pollen can be all over the place. And then you can have some movement of pollen by some of these non-buzz pollinators. And I'm going to show you, hopefully this video will play okay. This is actually a bee on partridge pea. So partridge pea also has some buzz pollination going on here, but the crops we think about it are things like tomatoes. So hopefully you can hear that buzzing. It's kind of an annoying little sound, but you can see now she was moving her legs too. So once that pollen falls on her, then she packs it down. And so that's what that buzz pollination looks and sounds like. You don't actually see the wings moving. They're just using those muscles in their thorax to vibrate against that. And so hopefully now you've seen all these different types of pollinators and different values of pollinators. And so we can switch or rotate into talking about the value of habitat for them. And so the idea is that we can help feed the pollinators so they can help feed us and help feed others, whether it be wildlife or livestock that then we consume. And oftentimes we think about these landscapes with these big beautiful flowers. So here's this nice stand at the organic farm, but in reality, if we think about functional landscapes for pollinators, it can look a lot different. And so it does require a bit of a mind change in terms of what we consider productive landscapes. And so I know for a lot of people, this is just disgusting, but for me, I think this is fabulous. And actually this was taken in New York, where there's a beekeeper who plants specifically dandelions for a dandelion nectar or honey crop. This is not that plot, but I just thought that was a neat little area where they just let it go. And really, it doesn't have to be that you let your entire yard go to weeds all the time, but you can maybe let different patches of it bloom at different times. So, and you can have things in the backyard be a little bit more hidden, but it doesn't have to be everything all at once, but just thinking about, is there something I could be doing different in my landscape that can help support the bees somewhat? And so maybe that is leaving behind a few weeds here or there. Okay, let's go on to, habitat use by bees, and specifically here we're talking about honeybees. They're collecting pollen, as I mentioned before, as a protein resource, but they're also collecting nectar that they can then convert into honey. And then of course we can save that for ourselves, but we can also use that in terms of keeping that around for the bees for times of the year where they don't have access to flowers. So whether it be winter or whether it be a really rainy day like today where they can't go out and fly and collect nectar, they can go into their pantry of honey. Another kind of added benefit through the consumption of nectar is, again, producing that wax. So when they have a high sugar intake during certain times of the year, like the spring, they actually produce wax through these glands in their abdomen, which then they can use to build more honeycomb and store more honey, but also store more pollen and also store more developing bees. So that's how these colonies can grow, is by the production of more wax to then make more comb. And additionally, another benefit that we don't talk about too much are that there are a lot of specifically trees that are producing resins that the bees can use. And so this is the sticky, it's like a really like a sap that's not liquid, essentially. It's more like a solid, really sticky, tacky um, oh gosh, I don't know. I just don't know what to call it. It's just basically a resin, and they collect on their legs like they do pollen. They bring it back to the colony, and so they'll oftentimes use this to gum up a colony closed so that ants can't come in. But they'll also use this. They'll just line their colonies with it too. And this has been shown in recent years is to have some beneficial activity in terms of being somewhat antimicrobial, possibly having some antiviral effects. And so we're trying to look into increasing the level of propolis that's collected and looking at the diversity of propolis produced by different types of plants in different regions. So another really cool area that we can think about how plants can benefit bees. We think about other types of pollinators and how they use the habitat. A lot of the native bees can use the plant material for nesting material. And so in this case here, we have some nice circular leaf cuttings here from a leaf cutter bee that is using that to separate out the cells of her developing offspring. And so they basically will make a long tunnel tube or use a stem and then lay an egg on a ball of pollen and then section that off, create basically a cell wall using plant material, or some different other types of bees will use mud. Some will use dead ants. There's all types of different materials that different types of bees use. But here, this leaf cutter bee uses plant materials. They especially love cutting out of roses. And so good to take a note when you see holes in your plant leaves to see what they look like. And if they're these really nice circular holes, it could be from a leaf cutter bee. And so we definitely want to be careful not to spray these plants with pesticides and thinking that this was damage due to things like a caterpillar, a pest caterpillar, because there are bees that are actually using this as nesting material. And then the other one that I wanted to point out here is, a lot of these plants can serve as host plants, meaning that they can support different types of pollinators. So in this case, we're looking at a monarch larva here, or caterpillar, consuming an Asclepias leaf. Just chowing down here on this flower. And so they're using this as the food resource for the larval form. And then the caterpillar goes off to another location to then pupate and form that beautiful chrysalis. So this is really important for things like lepidopterans. So, everyone says, this is great. Okay, so what do we do to actually support the bees and the pollinators? What should I plant? And in reality, that's almost multiple steps too far. We got to bring it back in. We all get excited, but we have to think about not what we should plant, but how we should plant. And so that site preparation, as all of you know, is really important. So when we think about site preparation for pollinator habitats, especially because we don't want these areas to be places where we're going to be using, ideally, we're not using a lot of insecticides or pesticides. And so we want to do as much as we can on the preparation early side of things to manage it as best as we can, so that later on it's low maintenance and that we don't have to go back in and deal with problem situations. So it does require that you know a little bit about the land and prepare the land as best as possible. And I mean that in terms of that you're increasing the likelihood of being successful with your plot, that it turns out to be what you have in your mind, and it doesn't end up being a field of weeds. And oftentimes the first year looks great. And then when Mother Nature comes in the second year, you'll see a lot of weeds out competing your plants. And so that's why it's really important to think about how you prepare that land, how you try to get rid of all of those weed seeds that are in the soil, that are in different layers of that soil. And so if you do things like disc and till up the soil, you're going to be bringing up new seeds, essentially weeds, to then germinate. And so oftentimes it requires a lot of turning up the soil, letting the weeds germinate and killing that down, and then doing that over and over again to try to decrease as many of the weeds that are like locked into that soil before you put in your pollinator intended seed there. And then thinking about perennials, it's not that you have one shot. I'm being a little bit simplistic here, but ideally, if you're putting in perennials and they're coming back year after year, which is fantastic, it makes it harder for you to go back into that plot and do any kind of supplements. So it's really important to do that soil testing to begin with, and then amend the soil as needed. So that way you don't have to try to mix things into the soil once things are already growing and worry about disturbing the plants that are possibly dormant at the time when you're actually doing those additions. And so then we can start thinking about what you actually plant. And that does depend on a lot of factors. And it's not like so easy that we just say, here's this laundry list of plants you should plant. I will show you a laundry list though in a little bit, but it does require some thought and consideration, again, in order to be the most successful, because the last thing we want is for someone to grow a pollinator plot that is not at all what they had in their mind, and they're disappointed by it, and then they just feel negatively about it. We want them to feel positive about pollinator habitat. And so the site selection really matters. We have to ask and learn about what does the site look like that you want to plant? What is, again, knowing a bit about the soil, but also thinking about what region are you in, and that can help inform what type of soil you have. What type of water supply do you have? Are you relying strictly on precipitation? Like today is a great day for precipitation, but not all at once. And so it becomes really hard when you put in really tiny pollinator seeds, and then you have a storm like this come through and it washes everything down into the gutter. You have really pretty gutters, but you don't have plants where you necessarily want them. Do you have irrigation? Do you have a water system in place to help support the growth of your seeds, especially if you're planting at a time of the year where you don't have reliable precipitation coming down? Sunlight's a big one. So a lot of the wildflowers that we plant are relying on high levels of sunlight. We're talking probably like 6 hours or more a day. It does become harder when you're thinking about shady areas, but there are a lot of trees that can also be really productive too. Here I'm showing a tulip poplar, which can be a great nectar source. I did have bees in an area where I had a tulip poplar grove nearby. It was hit or miss, and not because the plant wasn't producing nectar. It's just we'd oftentimes have storms when it was blooming, and that would wash out all the nectar. And so I don't rely strictly on one type of plant supply, essentially. And then thinking about pests in many ways. So that can be pest insects, but it can also be pests in terms of having deer and wildlife come through that just munch down all of the new growth, the tender growth before it can even go to flower. But the pests too, in terms of thinking about insect pests, is that I try to plant things that are not known to have major problems in terms of attracting pest insects, because I don't want to put myself in a situation where I'm going to be under pressure of using insecticides in an area where I'm trying to attract and support insects. So I'm oftentimes looking at different types of plant species that can be easily grown without the use of insecticides. And I could get rich if I had a go-to list for everyone on that. But it's a work in progress, and it also depends on your area and what else you have growing. Another thing too is thinking about the permanence. Is this site going to be pollinator habitat long-term? Is it going to be like that for years, or is it going to be like that for just this season? And that's going to influence what you plant there in terms of, are you going to do perennials or are you going to do annuals? Thinking that some of these perennials aren't going to bloom the first year. So obviously you're not going to plant those in a 1-year plot or a temporary plot. But then you have to think too about how much are you willing to put into and invest in this plot. So I'm not going to invest in high costly seed or plants in a plot that's going to be short term, right? And so thinking about that, you can get some cheaper plantings, especially if it is going to be a temporary plot. And we'll talk about some of those in just a second. A lot of those are plants that I usually use in farm settings that are temporary, but they can also be used in a home garden situation. And then thinking about individual goals and preferences. what in your mind, how do you expect your pollinator habitat to look? And if you want it to look like a manicured garden, that's fine. We have different recommendations for that versus if you want to have more natural looking, like prairie or wildlife plot, like I showed earlier. Just there are different plants we recommend for different things and different ways we manage them. But the awesome thing is that there are so many great, valuable plants out there that no matter what your vision is, there's a pollinator plant that we can recommend for you and that will work. And then thinking too about the types of pollinators that you're trying to support. So is this person trying to support honeybees particularly? Are they a beekeeper? And then even at that, what are they trying to do? Are they just thinking about the health of the colony, or are they also thinking about honey production? And honey production can be tough because you have to have many acres planted in order to have good nectar flow for your bees. So just some laundry list characteristics there. But then I just wanted to show you a quick couple videos here, a couple quick videos, just showing how plant selection can influence what types of pollinators you have coming into your yard. So here is some 4 o'clocks that came up really easily at one of these plots I had in South Carolina. And you can see by this flower structure, right? This is a long tubular flower. It's not going to be one that will be easy for honeybees to access or other types of bees, especially big bodied bees to access. But you'll be able to see here that this moth has this really long tongue essentially. So she can then be far away from the flower and has great aim and control over that proboscis, which is what we call an insect tongue, and is able to suck the nectar out from those long tubular flowers. And that's not to say all long tubular flowers cannot be accessed by bees. Oftentimes we'll see what we call cheaters or robbers. And so they'll actually just get close to where the nectary is and they'll chew a hole to access the nectar. And then you'll see subsequently other bees like honeybees coming through and they'll suck the nectar out too. So there's some cheating that happens in the pollinator plant world, unfortunately. And so we think about that moth's long proboscis versus here we have this honeybee with a pretty short proboscis, and so she wouldn't have been able to reach that nectar in that long tubular flower, but here she's able to basically squish her face into this composite flower head and collect nectar, basically suck up and collect nectar from all the little flowers that make up this inflorescence here. And so short tongue bees, there are long-term tongue bees, there are median tongue bees, and that can also influence the type and size of the type of flower that they can then collect from. So this is why it does kind of matter to know what type of bee people want to, if they want to support bees at all, or if they're after, say, like hummingbirds, or if they're after butterflies, or if they're after bees. It can really help to know so that we can make the right types of plant recommendations. And then also leading into this bigger question of what to plant, I do try to plant as much diversity as I can in the sense that I'm trying to have multiple species growing across all seasons. Of course, winter is a tough period, but thinking about at least spring through fall, and early spring is really important, as well as late fall and summer. Actually, around here, we have some of these drought situations. A lot of the nectar dries up, so it'd be great to have more plants that can still produce some nectar even when it gets dry out. But thinking about having this forage across as many seasons as possible, sometimes that'll just be planting successive batches of things like annuals. So even with things like herbs, I'll just plant multiple times within a year so that I have extended bloom periods, because one planting bloom time is not long enough to support the bees. And I do try to, a lot of the herbs are really popular with pollinators, especially bees. And so I plant a lot and then I let some of it go to seed for the bees. And then I keep some of it young and tender for culinary purposes. But for the most part, I let most of it go and let the bees pollinate. And then I have seed for the next year, essentially. And I do a mix of annuals and perennials. So I have annuals that will reseed every year and then it will actually bloom the first year. But I'll also have these perennials that'll come back year after year again. So it's not a high maintenance situation. And then thinking about forage all day. So I'm going to show you a cover crop in a second that I think is fantastic, but it usually, because it is so popular with the bees, it runs out of nectar by midday. And so that's why it's always good to have different types of pollinator plants around so that you can have kind of backup systems essentially. And if we want to have a diversity of bees, which can result in better pollination for many types of crops, one thing to do is to plant a diversity of flowers. And if you do want to support specifically native bees, then plant native plants, right? Because they have co-evolved for so long that they're a natural match there. But there is some work that's looking at some of these ornamentals that have been bred for traits that humans like, so like double petals or things that we like aesthetically, that some of these traits that the bees are attracted to disappear when they're bred for some of these other traits. So this is an ongoing area of research, but I'd say for now, try to be careful if you are trying to basically support pollinators to stick with more of the more natural cultivars that are available out there, thinking that Mother Nature and the coevolution with bees has led them to a nice interface there where it works for both of them. Some of these things, these traits that we're thinking about are things like UV nectar guides. And so some of the breeding for like double petals, we've actually seen that the UV nectar guides that the bees can see that we can't see, they show the bees where to go collect the nectar on the flower, they disappear. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they do. And so that's why it's an ongoing area of research. And as much as I love to talk about the diversity of plants, I mentioned before, here's this kind of laundry list of some of the popular pollinator plants that you see promoted out in the world, especially in this region. And these are great. And what you see here are there are different types of pollinators, insect pollinators here, different flower shapes, different flower colors. They bloom at different times of the year. But one thing too is when I mentioned diversity is if you're thinking about trying to plant specifically for things like honeybees, they go on one type of flower per foraging trip. And so having a ton of diversity and like not so many flowers of each one of those types of plants makes it hard for those bees to then search around to find that same type of flower to go collect from on a foraging trip. So it can be a little bit different in terms of how we plant for honeybees versus native bees. It might be that we plant more of in a block system, or we have plots still high diversity overall, but each plot is a little bit more or less diverse within the big scheme of things. So their search time and search efforts are not to the point where they're just trying to find the right type of flower there. So the other thing too is that we have different types of plants here that bloom at different times of the year. What I love are the goldenrods and the asters that bloom late in the season. And that's oftentimes when we have a dearth of nectar where we don't have a lot being produced out in the environment. So it really helps to have these to help boost the bees at the last time of the period of the year. And then thinking too about, okay, we just showed this laundry list, native bees, honeybees, I'm not sure what to do. There's this nice study done about a decade ago, actually, showing that there are some general plants general recommendations that can provide good sources of nectar and pollen for managed and wild bees, essentially. So all of the types of bees that are out there. And so thinking about this, there are what they came up with are some Asteraceae. And so here's that goldenrod again. Here are those asters. And I showed on that last slide some cup plant there. And then also in Lamiaceae, I showed bee balm on that last one. And then I'm going to show you a video is going to come up real quick about pycnanthemum. So mountain mint is also fabulous. Sometimes I'll see my honeybees on it, but for the most part, I usually see a lot of native bees and wasps on it. And then also native legumes can be really valuable too for providing some nutrients for these bees. So down here, you can see this honeybee on goldenrod. And here you can see this not so happy looking bee here on this aster out at the organic farm. And then one thing to also think about is attraction versus nutrition. So a lot of the plants that we recommend are based off of attractiveness and what the bees go to. So it's a newer area now is thinking about, well, what plants are actually good for the bees to go to? And so that means analyzing the nectar and the pollen to see with the pollen, what types of amino acids are in that pollen. There are 10 essential amino acids that honeybees need to consume in their diet. So looking at how different plants produce different proportions of amino acids, but also looking at lipids too is really important. And then, this is going to be a growing area. It is growing right now. And so hopefully we'll be able to have some recommendations coming up of plants that the bees are attracted to and we know provide the right nutrients for them. Here's this quick short video of here's this pygnanthemum that I had growing out in one of my plots. I just think it's a wonderful plant, low maintenance, easy, extended bloom time, because you can see each of these flower heads has many buds that will then bloom later on, not too many at any given time. So I just think it's fabulous. And then also thinking too a little bit about toxins. So not all flowering plants benefit bees. There are some that have toxins either in the nectar or the pollen, or sometimes both. And so this is also an area of research that needs a little bit more focus. It's oftentimes hard to study this because the bees are foraging on so many different types of plants. So we want to pay attention to that, because we don't want to make recommendations that can actually be doing harm to bees. So things like rhododendrons actually can be problematic for honeybees. And then like California, we had this buckeye plant that the adult bees are fine, but when they collect the pollen and then use that pollen to make baby food for the next generation of bees, all the baby bees die. And so then you lose a whole next generation of bees. So hopefully we can understand this a little bit more with further research. And I know I'm getting close on time, but I wanted to point out this study too. It's done on honeybees, but I think it's a nice way to think about how we can look at how different types of landscapes can benefit from what we can learn from different types of landscapes can benefit us in terms of what can we change and adapt from one area and apply to the other. So this was done in Ohio, and it was with honeybees. And so they looked at an interface. Basically, they put this observation hive right in the middle here, and they have this agricultural area on the left side, and then this urban area on the right side. And when we say agricultural or even urban, it's important, I think, to know what's actually growing in those areas. Not all agricultural areas are the same, right? And so thinking about the agricultural area that is the organic farm here in East Tennessee is really different than what agricultural landscapes look like in West Tennessee. And the ones in West Tennessee are not necessarily going to be as like row crops, as I mentioned, these wind pollinated agricultural areas are not going to benefit the bees as much as, say, like a fruit and vegetable agricultural landscape. So basically, they looked at these different areas and they watched these bees do a waggle dance, which I guess I took the video out of, but basically they can watch the bees to find out where they're foraging. So they watch their dance, calculate out where they're visiting to collect nectar and pollen resources. And so what they did is they mapped this, looking at this region over time in the summer. They were looking at August through the end of September. And they're looking at where the bees were actually foraging. And so the white areas are where there was some visitation. The red is where it's concentrated. And then at this bottom right-hand box here, this is basically all the dates combined. And you can see they tend to stay close to home. No one wants to go forage too far away. But here you can see they're mostly staying close to home. But there's a little bit more visitation out in this agricultural area. And so what's fantastic is that they then collected the pollen from those bees to find out what was actually being collected in this agricultural area. What was this agricultural area? And so when they then collected those pollens at these different time periods that corresponded to their dance visitations or dance locations, they're able to look at what the bees were actually collecting. And so what you hopefully can see here is that there's a lot of blue and there's a lot of this hot pink. And so most of this blue here is actually white clover. And then this bright magenta or hot pink is goldenrod. And so even though it's not the target crops, there are plants that are grown wild in agricultural areas and in pastures that can help benefit these bees. And so this is just something for us to think about in terms of, can we now apply some of this to even urban areas? There's no reason why we can't grow or let grow things like white clover in our lawns. Think again, changing mindsets a little bit, that a functional lawn may look a little bit different in the coming years. And then thinking too about goldenrod. A lot of people see it and they think allergies, but it's actually a really beautiful plant and it can help these bees this time of the year where it's really important for them. And then last, I just kind of want to get in a little bit about thinking about cover crops. And so, you know, I'm a big proponent of cover crops where I have area where I can plant in high densities and high acreage. And so I'm lucky that I have access to some land at the organic farm to be planting. So things like crimson clover and buckwheat, I kind of go back and forth between those two. Crimson clover early spring, and then the buckwheat in the summertime. And so here's just you know, example of this buckwheat field. Here's my little honeybee in the middle, but I also want to point out, even though this is not a native cover crop, it actually does promote and support a lot of different types of pollinators. So here's a carpenter bee. Here's a little fly. Here's a little skipper. Here's a little wasp. Here's a little native bee. And so what I also love about this cover crop is that there's not a lot of pest pressure. And so there's not a high need to use any kind of insecticide on it. So I think it's great. But I realize not everyone, and you can use these in even as green manure in you know, home garden settings. But I realize most people are thinking about, okay, I want to plant wildflowers. And so, you know, kind of flipping back to that, thinking about that there are different types of mixes available. So you have to think about, again, what those goals are. Thinking too, annuals and perennials and mix can be really helpful. Having some irrigation can really help for that establishment, like steady irrigation, not just a ton of rainfall and then a dry period and then a ton of rainfall. And they can be pricier than cover crops, but they are a longer term investment. Excuse me. Okay. Oftentimes too, think about planting these wildflower plots. It helps to have a carrier to help distribute and see where you're actually putting these little tiny seeds out there. So here we're using some sand or some oats out in this plot to put in this pollinator habitat. And we want it to change over time. So this is actually a plot out at the organic farm. You can see there's some of that canola out there. And then it starts to change throughout the season and you see a little bit more diversity. There were a lot of poppies that came up. Poppies are great in terms of having some pollen, not a great nectar source. But then there's also this turnover, and a lot of people see this and this is what they don't like, is they start seeing it turn brown. But this is great. I mean, it's awesome. You can go out and collect a bunch of seed. And even though this may look run down to some people, there's actually a ton of diversity that's in this field throughout the season, especially at this given time period. And you can see, again, lots of different colors, lots of different flower shapes. So that helps promote different types of bees as well. So, I mean, I think that this is a fabulous plot. And even when it's done blooming, it can still support pollinators. And so this is that plot in October in the fall, and you can see there's still some clover growing, and I still leave a lot of this vegetation behind. And so, oh, actually, I was going to point out two of my favorites here is having this long growing clover, but also blanket flower because it blooms throughout like the entire season. But then also how we manage this plot. And so I just want to point out that that's why it looks kind of messy, is that I'm leaving that habitat behind to create natural habitat for stem nesting bees. And so I'm leaving these, this is a nice illustration from Lillian Evans and Heather Holmes' book, and how you can use the habitat to just naturally promote nesting sites for native bees. And so here you can leave behind those dead stalks, and then you cut it back in the spring, early spring, to 8 to 24 inches, variable heights. And then the young bees that are looking for a place to nest will then pick out, or they'll excavate the pithy stems, and then they'll use that stem to then create that tunnel where they'll put in a pollen ball and lay the egg and then separate off that cell with plant material or ants or resins or mud or anything like that. And then you basically leave that. So you let it grow throughout the year. People don't realize that, you know, honeybees have a really quick turnover in terms of generation time. But with a lot of these native bees, it takes an entire year for them to have this turnover. And so that's what's happening in the summer, is that these little stalks that hopefully you won't see because your plants are growing have the developing bees in it for the next season. And so you actually leave it there through the fall and the winter, and they go through this diapause essentially. And then the next spring, they will emerge out. And so they are also looking for new nest sites. So just thinking about that in terms of how we can manage our landscapes to benefit the bees with food, but also to benefit them in terms of having nest sites. And then kind of lastly is touching on the value of this habitat. It can reduce robbing for honeybees. So when things get slim out in the field, bees will actually steal from one another, and this can increase disease transmission, and disease transmission also happens with other types of bees through competition. So we want to make sure that we have more pollinator forage available so there's less interaction between bees that can decrease the likelihood of spreading diseases. And then also habitat and forage can lead to better pollination services because we have more healthy bee colonies out there, and also some wild bees, and then also honey production in terms of native bees. And then on top of all that, just this quick laundry list of showing that it's not just the food resources themselves, but that there's constituents within the nectar and the pollen, things that are called phytochemicals that can help bees in terms of therapeutic value, in terms of dealing with viruses, in terms of dealing with pathogens, and then even with future exposure to pesticides. And so I promised, Natalie, we're at the end here, that talking to you about there are challenges and needs for more research in this area. So I already mentioned that we do a lot of plant recommendations based off of attraction, because that's what we have. And so we need to have this nutritional database. We need to have reliable methods of measuring nutrients, and then knowing that things like climate change actually affects pollen content and nutrient values is really important for us as we move forward in the future. And then thinking about how we can try to make some artificial diets and see if those will be just as good for the pollinators or not. And then a lot of this, then we're ultimately reliant upon the decision making by bees and what they want to actually visit. So I apologize for going so long, but I do have this QR code that can take you to my website if you if you want to look more into bees and the Master Beekeeping Program, as well as just information about webinars and everything else. But I will stop, and sorry, Natalie, I apologize. I hope that.
Oh, no, don't apologize. You are on perfect time. We actually purposely allowed a little bit of extra time for questions today so that we could go to break a couple minutes late. So yeah, you're perfect. And we even got a few good questions to throw at you here before we go to break. So coming from our question portal from some of our volunteers, you have a question that is about, for home vegetable gardens, do native bees pollinate better than honeybees?
So, I mean, this is one of those hard questions, is like, what is better, right? And so, so looking at those tomatoes, right? So if you want something that needs buzz pollination, then yeah, some of those native bees will be a better pollinator in that sense. And if you're growing like greenhouse tomatoes, then obviously you rely on different pollination sonicators and that type of thing.
Yeah, we use bumblebees.
Yeah, bumblebees are fantastic. So yes and no. So squash bees are fantastic in terms of pollinating squash plants in your yard. They're up earlier in the day, but it's one of these issues is if you don't have them in your area, then what do you do, right? And so that is one of these, and you tend to have beekeepers around in the state, all around the place. So you will have some of them that come in. And so like, visit by visit for a lot of these plants, honeybees don't do as well as native bees, but it's also a numbers game. If you have more honeybees around, they can compensate for their lack of efficiency by the number of actual individuals in the field. And so, I don't know, I just like to try to promote both. And it's been shown for a lot of crops that actually having many types of bees, honeybees, and different types of native bees, you end up with higher yields. So we like to.
Yes, that was perfect. So you actually already answered the second part of the question, which is, are there ever times when your generalist honeybees might displace your native bees? But essentially, oftentimes you see synergies rather than competition.
Yeah, and some of that has to do with time of day that they're active. Whether like for things even like blueberries, they need some of that vibration too. And so and it's a messy plant. So we still use honeybees for blueberry pollination, but it's often they can kind of come in and clean up, move the messy pollen around once it's been released by other types of bees. So yeah, they work together well.
All right, that is cool. Celeste, you can jump in here if you have any questions that you want to throw in. Oh, you turned your microphone off.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yeah, you're good.
Okay, Jennifer. So yeah, definitely had a few other questions here. So when you were talking about preparing those wildflower plots. I know that's on everyone's mind. And I feel this time of year is really when people get that idea in their head and they want to get some of those established. But in your professional opinion, would this be the best time to do that, or should they really have started, back in the fall?
Oh, so this is a good question. So this is my third, going on fourth year in Tennessee. And so, and I'm originally from California, so I'm used to predictable, dry, good or bad, however you want to see it, weather in California. And so it's really different here. And so one challenge I'm seeing is that if you start planting in the fall, especially some of these mixes that are mixes of annuals and perennials, you'll have them they'll start to grow in the spring, early spring, because we've already had these nice 80-degree days. And then you have like a hard freeze, or you have snow like we did a few weeks ago, and then everything dies off. And so there's a little bit of risk involved. So you'll have some that do well and survive throughout the winter. So things like clover can survive throughout the winter fine. But if I want to see all of this diversity in my seed mix bloom, I try to wait, even though it's really hard, I try to wait until after the freeze so that I can start planting now. But I mean, it is kind of a mix, right? Because I want there to be food for the bees in the early spring, but I also want things that are going to successfully grow later in the season. So It's a bit of a mix, but I would say if you plant some of these wildflower blends that have a lot of annuals that are going to come up because the environment seems right, and then we have a freeze, that can just be really disappointing.
But this is something to keep in mind for everybody. So if you have a substantial amount of perennials in that mix, understand that if you're seeding those in the spring, you're not going to reap the benefits of those perennials until the next year. So
sometimes like 2 or 3 years later, and I forget, and I was like, is that a weed? I don't even know. And I'm like, I'm just going to let it grow. And then it turns out to be a beautiful plant. So yeah, take some patience.
Yes.
Great point.
And I like how, you had mentioned when you were talking to kind of try to focus on mixes that have a variation of plants that, annuals and perennials, because you need something to span those gaps, right? I mean, perennials are awesome, but they tend to have a shorter bloom period, and annuals, can just go and go for that entire season, whichever season is there. So I definitely like using that mixture and utilizing both types of plants.
And you never know what's going to happen. That's one of the cool things about growing in Tennessee. It's just like it keeps you on your toes, and you can't count on anything. You just appreciate it when it works out.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And so then I'm going to field you one more. So if you had to tell us what your top favorite blooming plant for each season for our honeybees would be, what would yours be?
Okay. I'm going to go cover crop wise, just because they're low investment, and they're easy for me because I can work with the farm to put in high acreage of it. So I'll do a fall, late summer, early fall planting of clovers. So that comes up early spring. So I don't have to worry, and they have early spring planting because clovers do well overwintering. And then and that also, is a nitrogen fixer. So that's also positive. And then once that's done, then I will rotate into doing buckwheat, which is not cold tolerant at all. So that kills itself going into the winter. So I'm like ready to go to plant my, I can also kill it off to start up my crimson clover and clover blend for the following year. So I'm usually rotating between those two cover crops. And then like, honestly, for just like one of my favorite, I have two favorite wildflowers. So sorry, I'm going to go extra. I mean, I love Asclepias because I think it's just really awesome. And there's so much you can see and appreciate and learn and see all these interactions. But then I also really love, as I mentioned before, blanket flower, just because I think it's a beautiful flower. It blooms throughout the entire season. So it's giving everything a chance. And while I don't see my honeybees on it a lot in the early season, I see them visiting it later in the season when they don't have access to things like those cover crops.
Excellent answers, Jennifer. So Natalie, I have one more that goes along those lines, and it kind of just plays into what Jennifer was saying. Do we have time for one more question?
By all means. Yeah.
Okay. So we talked about Jennifer planting those clovers. So I know there's some controversy in the bee world about which clovers are the best.
Yeah. So Yeah, we were at a talk at one point, and yeah, someone had said crimson clover is not one that honeybees can reach. And I showed you pictures of honeybees foraging on crimson clover. So I want to dispel that. Thank you, Celeste, for giving me the opportunity to dispel that rumor out there that, yeah, actually crimson clover is one that I specifically plant to feed my bees. So pollen resource as well as a nectar resource. There's a honeybee blend from a seed company in Pennsylvania that has like 5 different clovers. And so that way you have an extended bloom time of all different types of clovers. So that's also an alternative if you want to just stick with nitrogen fixer legumes. That's a really nice one too. So thank you, Celeste. And thank you, Natalie, and thank you everyone for giving me a time to talk today.
Dispelling clover controversies. I had no idea.
Who knew, right?
Yeah.
And if there are more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll stick around for a little while.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. So we are gonna take about a 10-minute break right now, and we'll give you all a chance to get up, grab something to drink. We'll get our next speaker ready, and Dr. Tsuruda will watch the chat. So thank you very much, Jennifer, for a fabulous presentation. We'll see y'all back here in a few minutes.